Hashtag today we're using for online is Muslim Philanthropy, if any of you want to tweet. Because our guest editors are based abroad, I will just briefly introduce some of the content of the issue before introducing the panellists and getting their perspectives. So in short, the guest editors were Yunus Solar and Tariq Chima from the World Congress of Muslim Philanthropists, an organisation set up about a decade ago to try to improve the strategic clarity, collaboration and professionalisation of Muslim philanthropy around the world. And in September of this year, just last month, they met in London for their biannual Global Donors Forum. So we saw this as a good opportunity to time the events taking place at that forum in London with an issue devoted to the topic. And in short, to give you some of the background the guest editors provide in their absence, many of you will know this, but there are an estimated 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, constituting approximately 23% of the world's population, living across continents, contributing substantially to the world economy and to the social sector, developing non-profits, human welfare, social needs, and indeed creating foundations of their own in the spirit of what Migrant was saying. And there's potentially an enormous resource base to build new initiatives to advance social justice. There's a figure that's sometimes quoted that may not be 100% verifiable of $1 trillion a year of potential volume of Muslim philanthropy. If that is the case, that's clearly huge. But Muslim philanthropy is not just financial, but underpinned by a value base. And some of that value base comes from the Islamic texts, zakat, compulsory alms giving of Muslims, and sadaqah, a discretionary charity that can take the form of contributions of financial resources, donation of material needs, or voluntary service. And please feel free to elaborate in your presentations, or correct me if there's any correction required. Tariq Chima, the guest editor, suggests that there's several challenges, pressing challenges for Muslim philanthropy. The first, he argues in the essay, is to promote a more strategic and accountable philanthropy that complements and enhances an older version of charity, which is more personal and spontaneous. So how can Muslim philanthropy build new models of giving which are refining old models embedded in vibrant Islamic tradition? That's one set of challenges that he poses. Second is how to develop a more holistic approach to such philanthropy based on more crisis prevention rather than crisis management. He also points to the need to unlock capital embedded in the Waqf through Islamic financial institutions to enhance the management of zakat and improve the functioning there. There's a piece about the Waqf in South Africa in the issue. And the fourth challenge he highlights is to overcome prejudice. Muslim philanthropy is still being challenged by suspicion, stereotypes, and in some cases negative publicity. And of course it isn't simply beholden on Muslims and Muslim philanthropy to overcome prejudice, but people that hold the prejudicial views. But clearly there's an issue that we might want to discuss. So he argues there's two priorities. One is more strategic and accountable philanthropy and better data to inform it. And data is a question that contributors refer to a lot. And the second is a resolution of long-standing religious tensions and geopolitical conflicts, and a responsibility of philanthropists to play a role in conflict resolution, which is a topic that is maybe underexplored in philanthropy, and it might be something that Huda in particular might want to, given her background and work. So without further ado, and thank you for your indulgence for that slightly longer preamble, I'm going to introduce the panelists. On my right is Shenaz Bunglawala, who's the Assistant Director of the Aziz Foundation. Apologies, is that the right pronunciation?
That's fine. People always struggle, I'm used to it.
And on my near left, Huda, Jawad, who's a Clore Social Leadership Fellow in 2017, the Communities Coordinator for Safe Communities, and a Trustee of Ending Violence Against Women, but also has a background in philanthropy and conflict resolution as well. And on my further left is Fozia Irfan, who's the Chief Executive of the Bedfordshire and Luton Community Foundation, and also a Trustee of the Association of Charitable Foundations. And it's great to have the CEO of ACF here today as well. Thank you, Carol. We're going to start with Fozia, who unfortunately has to leave early. But she's going to reflect on some of those arguments of the guest editors and also explain where she agrees and disagrees. And over to you, Fozia, and thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Unfortunately, Moira and Charles, between them, have covered everything. So this will be very short. From the outset, I should say that I'm here as an outsider to institutional Muslim philanthropy. I have some knowledge of philanthropy per se, and some of you may have observed that I am Muslim, so I have some knowledge of being Muslim, but the two worlds haven't collided that much for me. Now, what I'm taking as the definition of Muslim philanthropy is actually the one that was given in the Alliance magazine as the theological practice or philanthropic actions of people who happen to be Muslim. And I think it's important to set those parameters. Now, we know that Muslim philanthropy itself is as old as time, and it's a key component of faith. But for me, the emergence of institutional Muslim philanthropy, particularly in non-Muslim countries, is an interesting area which I'm going to focus on. There are certain elements of Muslim giving which I think are of note. Firstly, the fact that it's faith-inspired, it's a spiritual and social act, and this remains an important tenet of practicing your belief. Although there has been some recent research that in some countries, for example in Turkey, that faith-inspired aspect is declining. Secondly, Muslim giving has traditionally been focused on emergency humanitarian relief. And thirdly, the act of giving in itself has been seen as important and not necessarily what it achieves. And that poses both challenges and opportunities. And I think that if you bear those three things in mind as a backdrop to this conversation, I think it will give you some greater understanding. So as Moira was actually talking and explaining about Paul Hamlyn Foundation, the word reactive came up. And that is traditionally what Muslim giving has been focused on. So very much overseas, for example, for UK residents, overseas emergency relief, rather than being strategic and thinking about underlying issues of poverty and deprivation. But, and I'm going to focus on this, on the UK, this type of giving is a reflection of context, particularly in the UK, where the wider context for the majority of Muslims here has been one of migration and communities working out issues of identity and belonging. So that is the context within which giving is pursued. And I once read an article about Jewish philanthropy in America, where they described a three-stage process for migrant philanthropy. The first stage is when migrants move to a country and their philanthropy or their giving is focused really on supporting themselves and their country of origin. The second stage is when the second generation establish themselves. They then start to build infrastructure organisations to support their communities, and that's where some of their philanthropy is directed. And then the final stage is when that community then starts to work within the mainstream, so then starts to fund all types of projects which are not limited or just purely focused on their heritage. And I think that's, although it's an oversimplification, I think there's an element of truth within that. And I think, in my opinion, I would say that Muslim philanthropy in the UK is probably at that second stage, where we're now just starting to see some institutions, such as the National Shenaz Foundation, focusing on channeling funds within the communities in the UK. There are a number of challenges that Muslim philanthropy faces, but also huge opportunities. And I'm looking at this in terms of perspectives from both the donor and the beneficiary side. In terms of donors, the challenge remains to take what some see as a personal, even private act, and convince donors that there's a case to be made for strategic, collective and collaborative giving to tackle some of the underlying issues which face all communities, but particularly Muslim communities. That, I would say, is the single most difficult hurdle and challenge that fundraisers who are fundraising from donors will face. In some quarters, in some schools of thought, the giving of charity is seen as very much a private act which you shouldn't talk about. The other issue is that some of the largest fundraisers in this country, and conversely there are also grant makers, are Muslim charities such as Islamic Relief, yet the majority of their funding distribution is overseas. In the meantime, some of the most underprivileged and underfunded communities are Muslim communities in the UK. I work in a community based in Bedfordshire. I work with many communities in Luton. Luton is quite unique. It's a super diverse town, which means that there is no majority community. There is, however, a large Muslim community, and every year they raise, and this is not an exaggeration, they raise millions within the community for overseas relief, for humanitarian causes, etc. Yet they struggle to raise funding for their own clubs. So there's a huge disconnect there, which I think needs to be explored. Turning next to beneficiaries of Muslim philanthropy, the research shows that there is a chronic lack of funding for BME voluntary-led organisations within the UK, many of which work with Muslim communities. My challenge to new institutional Muslim philanthropy is really to think about being strategic and prioritise and thinking about the long-term social change which they want to see. There's a significant problem with a lack of strong infrastructure organisations which support communities, particularly BME communities and Muslim communities. Now, I don't for a minute advocate that Muslim philanthropists should only fund BME or Muslim organisations in non-Muslim countries, but I would advocate that they are in a position to take an equity-based grant-making perspective which recognises the differentiated situation of these communities for historical and social reasons and works with them to design solutions. For too long, many mainstream traditional foundations have failed underfunded communities because they've taken an equality approach based on universal grant-making principles. And I think using an equity-based approach and focusing on the communities which are underfunded traditionally could be a real innovation within the Muslim philanthropic sector. A further characteristic of funding Muslim communities, and this is true in America and in the UK, is in relation to trust. New foundations are operating in a context where the only funding specifically given to Muslim communities in the UK was wrapped in the Preventing Violent Extremism agenda. The single most damaging and degrading way of distributing funding, which caused deep divisions and huge mistrust of external organisations offering funding. So maybe this is an area which Muslim philanthropy can have an advantage and make inroads, but they will also face scrutiny and questions about their validity and credibility, particularly if they're promoting civic engagement. I would go one step further and say that there's also a role for the new foundations to have an influencing position in the development of Muslim communities themselves, which have been hampered by a lack of space for diverse voices. And this is the bit where I don't mince my words and I don't sit on the fence. But the traditional religion-based institutions such as mosques and other community centres founded in the 1970s in this country remain patriarchal, misogynistic, and based on the feudal system, and they are seats of power for old men and they perpetuate inequality. Yes, I'm not sitting on the fence at all. But new foundations have the ability to create new spaces, new leaders, and encourage new thought for the development of Muslim communities in this country. And this is especially important given the constant questioning of the place of Muslims in the UK. In summary, I'd say that Muslim philanthropy worldwide, but particularly in the UK, has a huge opportunity to be as bold and as ambitious as they like, without being tied to generations of foundation practice, which can be extremely restrictive. There's an opportunity here to really tear the rule book up and show the rest of the foundation sector how to bring about systemic social change if they think strategically and they establish trust both within and outside Muslim communities. There's a rich tradition and culture of giving within Muslim communities which gives strong foundations for the future of Muslim philanthropy. And this, coupled with the new dynamism entering the sector, means that Muslim philanthropy really is limited only by its imagination. Thank you.
Thank you for that very compelling and forthright kind of presentation. Lots of thoughts I'm sure that you all have, but we'll hold them so that we can hear some reflections from you, Shenaz, maybe on some of the points Fozia mentioned as well as what you prepared as well.
Thank you. So you set 4 questions, and I'm not going to take them prescriptively, if that's okay. The one that I did want to start on was your opening question about what inspires the Aziz Foundation to work with communities beyond Muslim communities, because I think this answers some of the points that Fozia has raised. Why does the Aziz Foundation set itself to work with the disadvantaged communities in general and then targets very specific communities, black communities, white working class communities, gypsy roller traveller communities and Muslim communities? I'm not suggesting that the balance between those 4 communities is an equal one. Much of the Foundation's work actually is focused on Muslim communities, but there is a segment of it that is very specific about working alongside all of those communities, recognising 2 very important principles that were set up when the Foundation was established. The first is a very prosaic explanation. It is that we are a family-led foundation, and it's the family's wishes that we institutionalise in the Foundation and then operate as a basis of principle in terms of our activities. And that is simply that the family did want work to be done in ways in which Muslim communities and the support to Muslim communities didn't engender resentment among other communities, particularly in those parts of the UK where they lived alongside other communities that were equally disadvantaged. And if we think of Muslim communities as being those that often are at the bottom league of socio-economic indices or health indices, employment indices, etc. There are other communities that are also within that basket of falling below a certain percentile. And the idea that you could work with Muslim communities and not generate forms of resentment that end up consolidating or reinforcing other aspects of work that we want to do with supporting Muslim communities in the public sphere will be sort of, doing something with your right hand and not quite knowing where your left hand had ended up. So the first is a very prosaic. It is what the family wanted, and they wanted it for a very specific reason. The second is an empirical explanation, and that is from work that we've done examining attitudes towards Muslims and looking at polling data on attitudes held about Muslims by ordinary Britons. The first of research that we've commissioned suggests that when ordinary people are asked to make associations, spontaneous associations with Muslims, 2 of the most significant terms that emerge are terrorism and religious. And I think we can assume reasons for why terrorism is conflated with Islam and with Muslims. It has a whole contextual and causal reasoning behind it. But the presence of religious in that context, I think, is really fascinating, because it is, if the 2 are utilised in the same space, the cognate nature of associating religious and terrorism has its own dynamic. But if you were to separate the religious aspect of it, if people are associating Muslims with being religious, why is it that religiosity is not seen as a benign value in our society and is seen as something that's quite malignant? And I think that's a really important question. And how we can, through philanthropy, transform people's understanding of Muslims as religious individuals in society for the benefit of society, that what materialises out of their religiosity is something for both the good of their own well-being, their spiritual development, their association with communities, etc., but also for the well-being of society at large, is that there is something intrinsically benign about religion in public life and religion in our society. The second piece of research, which I think is quite instructive, is polling data. So the first time that I came across this particular question that was asked by YouGov in a poll that was published was in March of 2015, but I understand in a tracker that this question is one that has been asked between January of 2015 and July of 2018, and it is whether or not people in Britain think that Islam is compatible with British way of life. And invariably 50%, give or take 2 or 3, 50% will say that they don't think Islam is compatible with life in Britain. Around a quarter will say that they think it is, and around 20% will say that they don't know. The idea that people don't associate Islam in Britain with all of the manifestations and richness of Muslim communities and their lived experiences, I think, is something really problematic. The notion that that the presence of Islam in Britain is seen as something that can't be inducted within lifestyles that exist in this society, or that the specificities of lifestyles associated with Islam can't find a home in Britain, I think are really problematic. When we're looking at the empirical data, and then we're looking at how it is that we foster solidarity between different communities, I think this is where the impetus of working across communities takes on a real importance. It isn't just that we're interested in Muslim communities, we're interested in how people appreciate Islam in Britain, how people relate to Muslims among their neighbours, how they associate Islamic values with life in Britain, and see an alignment, a harmony, and even where there is differentiation, that the differentiation isn't seen as something negative, but is seen as something that is intrinsically different just about Muslims. That's why our focus is on disadvantaged communities in general. The principal bulk of our work actually is with Muslim communities, and we make no apology for that. I mean, it is largely because the Aziz family is interested in the fortunes of British Muslims. I would say that, I suppose 2 points that I want to make in relation to some of the thought that Fozia has shared are that philanthropy as institutions, I mean Muslim philanthropy as foundation, as institution building and institutions in operation, brings with it a degree of public accountability. And I think how we go about supporting Muslim communities in that respect isn't just how we operationalise the family's wishes and how it is that we dispense money for Muslim communities in the UK. It's also with an eye to the accountability that we present to British Muslims about the work that we do. The setting out of our own strategic plans and where they sit within where it is that Muslim communities believe the strategic investment should be made by philanthropic organisations. And that is an ongoing dialogical exercise. I mean, there is an aspect of it that is very internal. It is what we do as a foundation. It's where we set out our markers. It's what we establish as parameters against which we want to assess ourselves. But there is a part of it which is a public accountability process, and that is a conversation that is ongoing between institutions and Muslim communities about the work that we do for them, with them, alongside them, and where we foster partnerships where they work alongside others in society. The second point I would raise is that, and I think this is a conscious fear, is of philanthropy as instrumentalization. And you spoke, Fozia, you mentioned that a lot of work that had been done with BME communities in the UK over the last decade and a half has actually been prompted by the injection of money that came out of a prevent agenda. I think there are different iterations of the dissemination of that funding, and there are different complexities in terms of how the funding was allocated, for what purposes, and what agendas may have driven particular choices. But in the same way that we wouldn't choose to, excuse me, that we wouldn't reflect on that exercise of what prevent funds did to Muslim civil society, and create tiers within Muslim civil society between the haves and the have-nots, and the dynamics that then materialise between different actors in Muslim society. Neither would we want to see institutions of philanthropy replicate some of those models. And I think some of that does boil down to public accountability. I think other aspects of it has to do with the conscious choices we make as institutions. And to that extent, I would say that from the Foundation's perspective, our interest is in seeing a rich, diverse and plural Muslim community engaged in infrastructure development within its own community and in its public advocacy. It isn't that we see a sort of preferentialism towards particular forms or manifestations of Islam. We assert no preference in that regard. Anyone who will self-identify as a Muslim is someone that we would regard as a Muslim. If they put on their application that I regard myself as a Muslim and make an application on that basis, we would judge it on the merits of the application. We wouldn't interfere with the process of self-identification. And I think it doesn't entirely guard against instrumentalization, but I think it remains a conscious effort not to frustrate the development of Muslim civil society in ways in which we become directional rather than facilitators of social change. You asked a question in relation to the British Muslim Trust, which was the consultation for which was launched at the Global Donors Forum. And I would say in relation to that, so that there is, I mean, some of this is entirely tentative, because even the Aziz Foundation itself is only 3 years old, and we're still learning in terms of consolidating institutional processes that allow us to recognize where it is that we're making a mistake, where it is that we can recalibrate some of our thinking, where it is that we can identify things that have worked really well and then replicate those models across the organization. The British Muslim Trust emerged out of those early conversations of the Foundation's genesis, that once we had started getting work underway in our 3 areas of work on community development, public engagement and leadership development, we had a lot of other Muslim philanthropists who were interested in both the triad that we had set up as our particular objectives, but then the way that we had approached attaining those objectives. And it became a process of them suggesting to us, well, you've established scholarships, we would also like to establish scholarships. You're doing work on community infrastructure development, we also want to do work in community infrastructure development. You're doing public engagement, and we really like the way that you've been capacity building in Muslim organisations, that they're able to articulate for their needs in the public sphere more cogently. And surveying these conversations that are sort of occurring in parallel and as multilateral exercises between groups of actors, it made sense to try to think about a model of creating an umbrella of philanthropic organisations that can collaborate about the way that they do work together, so that, you know, where there are harmonies in their particular objectives, that those harmonies can be attained by more cost-effective means, so that there's not a simple replication of a lot of the work that they're doing by different organisations. And at the same time, where there is a differentiation in their objectives, there can at least be some attempt to align the differentiation with the strategic needs of Muslim communities, and that becomes a collaborative exercise in strategic visioning, not necessarily in strategic delivery. And I think, I mean, the BMT at the moment is a conversation that is underway. It is a conversation that brings together both philanthropic institutions, that is family-led Muslim charitable foundations, but also the larger Muslim charities. And the sort of nexus of private philanthropy and philanthropy through zakat and sadaqah is part of that conversation. Is where do both of those sources of philanthropy in Muslim communities, where do they play a part in this wider collaboration in the sector? You asked whether or not I felt Muslim philanthropy in the UK punches below its weight because the Muslim community is disadvantaged in so many ways. And I would read the question slightly differently. I wouldn't ask whether or not Muslim philanthropy is punching below its weight. I would ask whether or not the force of the punch is being felt in wider society. And I think that question is both a reflection on Muslim philanthropists, is that, you know, how forcefully are we making the case for the work that we're doing and the transformation that we're effecting. And whether or not, I mean, because in some respects the figures suggest that Muslim charitable giving is actually above average when you look across other faith communities. The difference is we're not in the numerical figure, it is whether or not the social effect of it, or the material difference it makes to people's lives, or to community institutions, or to the dynamics within Muslim communities, or within Muslim communities and between other communities. Can you assess and measure that change? And I think there is a lot more work to be done here, largely because monitoring impact evaluation is relatively new to the sector as a whole, but is perhaps acutely new to Muslim organisations. I think some of it requires a more empirical assessment of what kind of tools and methods can we utilise to capture that impact. I think in other cases it is about recognising that impact is something that will have a time lag, but are we at least able to measure the process at which we're doing it, so that, you know, in 5 years' time, when we hope we will have attained a target, we find that we're completely off track. And I think both of those things still require further consideration. I would say that given that Muslim philanthropy is part of a wider sector of philanthropy, and that it borrows quite a lot from academic research, and this is an emerging area in academic research, there is a lot of conversation and a lot of tools that are being built for these purposes that we certainly have capacity to utilise. And then the last question is, what do I see changing about Muslim philanthropy? I would say three things. And I'll conclude here. I would say, firstly, is leadership. I think Muslim both charitable foundations and Muslim charities are showing the kind of leadership about the way they go about philanthropy in the UK in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. I think some of it arises out of an intergenerational shift in some of those organisations. I think it also emerges out of the agency that you're now seeing articulated by British Muslims, that they want to see a lot more of their money spent at home, and they want to see a lot more of it spent in the communities where it is that they experience the largest amount of disadvantage, or where it is that those organisations don't serve their needs. They want to see philanthropy transform some of those dynamics. The second aspect, I would say, is intergenerational, and I think you can detect this in terms of the affinity that younger Muslims will associate with a sense of Britishness and older Muslims, and I think this affinity helps situate this in sort of the phase 2 that you were referring to in terms of phases of philanthropy, is that when you start envisioning the future of British Muslims in 2050, 2080, you're looking for the kind of infrastructure and the kinds of consolidation of that identity within the national space that you want to see. And what does it take to get there? What kind of institutions do you need? What kind of leadership do you need? What kind of trends should you be observing now to ensure that philanthropy is addressing the issue when it materializes in 20 years' time and that problem emerges within the community? I think intergenerational shifts are part of that. And the last one I would say is the impact. We are seeing philanthropists now assess what is the impact. I think some of this emerges from the dynamic of those philanthropists. Some of them are entrepreneurs, and I will say this for the Aziz Foundation, that our chair of trustees is an entrepreneur, is someone who's been a very successful property entrepreneur. And it is his dynamic that, it isn't that I'm engaged in philanthropy because I feel that I've got the capacity to do it. It is that I want to see philanthropy seed other things that will then have sustainability capacity that thrives in its own setting. It shouldn't be the case that my philanthropy becomes a codependency relationship. That's not what I'm in this for. I'm in this for because I want to facilitate those seeds from being planted to see their early rooting, to provide them with everything that is possible within the confines of a philanthropic foundation that then allows them to seek other models for sustainability. Some of it is social investment, some of it emerges out of Muslim communities responding to their own needs and recognizing that they can't rely on philanthropists to fund them in perpetuity. And to do that, I think philanthropists and beneficiaries need to see impact, because it's from impact that you will develop this virtuous circle where philanthropy doesn't become something that is enabled from the top. It is something that then becomes driven from below.
Thank you. Thank you. Shenaz, another really wonderful presentation. I hope you're enjoying what you've heard so far as much as I am, because even though I'm familiar with the world of philanthropy, these debates about what's happening on the horizons of both the Muslim community, Muslim philanthropy and British society are taking us forward into a potential future, giving us a sense of what that might look like. So thank you for that. I'll hold, again, my questions, and if you can hold yours until we've heard from Huda. Jawad, Huda, over to you.
Yes, well, thank you for amazing presentations. I don't know what else to say, because we've said it all. That's the point of being last on the panel. But I think what I can contribute to is commenting on the kind of the context and how Muslim philanthropy is driven, what institutions are there, and therefore what trends that we have certainly appearing. And so, as my wonderful panellists have said, that the act of giving and philanthropy is kind of a tenet of Islam, so it's not something new. And what's interesting is the point when it becomes an individual act, and then how do you transfer that into a social impact? And I think what's interesting, particularly in the Shia school of thought, is that we do have ready-made institutions by which that kind of act of giving, individual act of giving, is then redistributed to wider society. And so not only do we have zakat and sadaqah, but for Shias we also have khums, which means you have to pay a particular percentage of your earnings to your chosen religious leader. And religious leaders, or ayatollahs as we commonly know them, are chosen there are a number of them at the one and the same time. So we don't have a single pope, we have several. And they are elected by the community for their own credibility of kind of knowledge and experience. And their job is basically to steward and shepherd the community and to act as the unofficial welfare state that doesn't kind of exist in most Muslim societies or Muslim majority societies. And I think what's interesting in certainly Philanthropy from a Muslim perspective that is based outside of Muslim majority countries is how do you translate traditional understandings and kind of behaviours of giving to a context where it's totally different in terms of particularly in terms of a minority context. Actually, there isn't someone who knows better than you religiously, and there's also so many choices, but also increasingly we are asking for accountability and we are asking to find out where our money is spent. And my co-panelists have outlined very articulately the reasons why philanthropy can become instrumentalized and actually becomes opaque. There is the firm belief that you don't ask where your money went because it is kind of almost irreligious or against the spirit of giving. So, and we often hear as children and as adults that when religious figures in history gave, they never identified themselves, they never asked, they never kind of claimed their philanthropy. So that's a tension. And I think also, but increasingly, as Shenaz said, we have a growing British religious community, or British community identified as Muslim. But globally, we have the highest rates of young people and a growing population in the world as Muslims. We are globally centred around urban centres, and so there is the phenomena of the mipster, the Muslim hipster, who has, or she has, a very particular idea of a global community, global values of giving, global values about what is environmentally sustainable, what is worthy, equality, gender recognition, all that kind of stuff. And that is a mismatch between what is available for them to channel their funds and their charitable giving through. So I think having organisations and foundations that can speak to that is very, very important, because traditionally, particularly in foundational giving, as has been said before, families choose what's appropriate, and it kind of goes into this black hole and nobody kind of knows what's happening with that money. So I think that's important. And also, as a community, there is also a tension in the leadership space of Muslim philanthropy, is that if we decide to provide funds, and as you kind of quite rightly said, we can raise millions for emergency causes, but we can't fund youth centres. I think that's, again, a typical kind of scenario in any development of a migrant community. But, we have I called it the kind of the worthy foreign cause, which, schools, earthquakes, etc., outside of the UK or Europe. And then we have, in Europe, the bricks to heaven phenomenon, where if I fund a mosque, then I've secured my place in the afterlife, etc. But I think there is that the kind of the generation shift that says, actually, I want to do something that recognises that we have poverty, that we have domestic abuse, that we have single mothers, that we have needs as for older Muslim men and women who are isolated in their own communities, food banks, etc. And I think that the kind of the development, I feel, is the kind of the enabling of that, but in a way that measures the impact, as Shenaz says. And I think also what's really important is that the role of which the values that you spoke to, Shenaz, in the research polling, that actually 50% of people don't feel that Muslim values are compatible with the UK, is really, really worrying, because I think what the perception therefore is that there is, people don't know that the actual role that spiritual or religious-based giving has in conflict resolution, whether it's outside of its major conflicts or conflicts within the family and within communities. And so, there is a huge role for religion to play in conflict resolution. There's examples of when, particularly with the ISIS phenomenon in Iraq, religious institutions, through the many ayatollahs, have opened up their infrastructure in terms of houses, food, employment, colleges, schools, because that's what they fund, to internally displaced people from the northern parts of Iraq and Syria, who are not necessarily Muslim, but they've been hosted for free, and emergency kind of support for these groups and communities, because it was felt that these are our brothers in humanity and sisters in humanity. We need to kind of step up. I think also in terms of what Charles alluded to, the work of conflict within a political context, and the work that certainly we, when I worked at Forward Thinking, did in terms of bringing more longer lasting communication and peace between the religious actors in the Israeli-Palestinian issue is also important, because there was a recognition that actually religion is the factor that will make anything stick, because increasingly sidelining the role of religion as problematic kind of ignores the fact that actually it is religious values that can motivate people to find a solution to issues. And that's particularly what the work that Forward Thinking did with Israeli and Palestinian counterparts, where they kind of worked with religious movements and religious political parties in both regions. But also in terms of the work in the UK here, I think particularly the work that we do at Standing Together and in the Safe Communities programme is recognising that religious communities need that capacity to respond to everyday issues like domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. But where do they get that from? Because the judgment is, well, you're religious and therefore inherently violent and regressive and conservative, and therefore you will not be able to deal with issues of women and young people appropriately. And I think the work that we've been doing for the last sort of 18 months has proved actually there is a hunger and a requirement and a desire for much more engagement and capacity building. But there is literally nobody doing it. There is everybody and the kind of restrictions that you talked about in terms of the values of funding require that we don't sort of discriminate against various religious groups, has been a driver, or that religious funding comes from a prevent-led kind of counter-terrorism agenda has created a real suspicion with people. But the actual fact that there is a real need, and I think that's a really important trend to kind of work with communities alongside of enabling them to respond appropriately to issues that they feel are of relevance and of priority to them.
So have you talked to any senior management
and then I think one of the final things that I want to touch on is the issue in terms of the trend of having increasingly much more gender-based work in Muslim philanthropy is also of interest. And I think there are several reasons for that. I think there is definite push factors from external kind of forces, whether it's government, the Charity Commission, or the Prevent Agenda, but also there's increasingly a desire and attitudinal change within Muslim communities. Actually, we can't not talk about this anymore. And I think the challenge has been kind of trying to work with funders who have the work around gender equality as an aspiration, but they don't technically have the strategy or the tools or the know-how to enable that. So I think that's something that anybody here working with the Muslim communities can support and help. So.
Thank you very much for that. I'm really glad you mentioned the work you did at Forward Thinking in the Israel-Palestine conflict, because that conflict really has a highly charged effect on Jewish-Muslim relations in the UK. And when I worked in a Jewish foundation working with Forward Thinking, I was able to go to Gaza and meet some of the political representatives there and give some sense to the Jewish community and here about those realities. So that question about interfaith connections, and which is obviously very much part of your comments as well, about how people in other communities understand each other or misunderstand each other, is clearly relevant, but also relates to the question of what risks foundations and philanthropy can take. But before any of us say more, I think it's a great opportunity to hear from you, particularly your questions, particularly to Fozia, who'll have to leave sooner. But really, if we can just take them in sets of threes, there's lots of very interesting material to comment on. Not quite sure which direction the debate will go in, but I'm looking forward to hearing. Maybe we can start with, if you raise your hand, Aditi, and then take the lady back. Just introduce yourself as well.
Aditi Thora, Thomson Reuters Foundation. It's a question for Fozia, actually. I was reading the Aziz piece in the Alliance magazine about Muslim philanthropists having an additional responsibility to act as ambassadors of their religion and encourage each other to foster an environment of solidarity and social justice for all. Given what's happening in countries like Saudi, how do you see that role of Muslim philanthropists as ambassadors?
Well, I think in many ways it's a double-edged sword. I think the question of representation is one that is always thrust upon minorities. So wherever I walk into a room, I will always be the representative for all Muslim communities. That's just the way it is. And if you talk to anybody from BME communities, that's the way that we perceive. We speak on behalf of everyone. So there is that aspect where there is that huge responsibility, but also burden. And the double-edged aspect of that is because of the expectations placed, the additional expectations placed on anyone who's doing this particularized type of work, especially when it's new. And it's a very grey area, because if, for example, you are too overt or too specific, then you become tokenized. And if you're too generic, then your community may disassociate from you because they feel that you don't speak for them. So it's an area where, especially for new foundations, I think they have to tread very carefully in terms of who they are and who they speak for.
And just briefly to come to Shenaz, who represents the Aziz Foundation, do you feel that weight of expectation because of what you're doing, what you're pioneering in the last 3 years? Do you feel that weight as an ambassador?
The irony is, I think sometimes that Muslim philanthropists feel it from the heat from their own communities, not from other communities. Sometimes we're criticised for the work that we do with other communities, and the question is, why will you do it with certain other sections of society when you know that there's a desperate need in Muslim communities? So it can cut both ways. It's not just that we're judged from the outside. There's a lot of judgment that goes on within Muslim communities as well. There's always been the risk that philanthropy will be misconstrued as proselytism or forms of proselytization. I think that's the risk that you take with you. But I'd like to, certainly from the Aziz Foundation's perspective, over the last couple of years, I would say that the work that we've been doing, I think, speaks for itself. I think people's appreciation of what the foundation is and what we do comes from what we've been able to put into the public domain about all of our work. I think perhaps sometimes transparency can play some part. The more you're able to disclose the type of activities that you're engaged in as philanthropists, the easier it becomes for you to mitigate the risk of people projecting onto you their own prejudices about what you're doing and not necessarily related to the work that you're actually doing, which is out there in the public domain. To come to your question about what's happening in Saudi, I think there is a significance about recognising that the philanthropy we're talking about in this context is British Muslim philanthropy. And it is about British Muslims and the association they make with their British identity, with work in Britain, with a connection to communities that live here in this country. It can't be disassociated from global Muslim philanthropy because there are strong intersections of money flowing in both directions. But for foundations that are established in the UK, whose modus operandi are the communities that they live alongside on these isles, that's the parameters against which we want to be judged.
That's clear. Just one follow-up question though on that. How do you reconcile that tension between that accountability and transparency that enables you to speak for yourself with being at the same time, as you said in your principles, a family-led foundation, so families on the trustees, families driving the decisions, and that might be replicated by other Muslim families with their own philanthropies. So is that tension you're seeing as you develop?
I suppose tensions are inevitable in any entity that is corporate, non-corporate in that term, in a setup. I mean, to the extent that you've got the impetus for establishing institutions that take processes as objective measures that you apply, and individuals who are at different positions of decision making. And in grant making, it can be complicated because there is always groups of people that will make decisions about which grants get money and which ones don't. The transparency aspect of it, I would say, are the processes that you establish and the tests that you set for yourself against the risk of personalizing or creating structures of decision making that become personality driven or dominated by individuals, not processes. I think that's part of the accountability. The transparency is about both the way that we approach our work and the way that our approach is tested in the public domain. So recognizing that we're putting all of this material onto our website, making it accessible to people, who we're funding, why we're funding it, what our objectives are, what targets we set for ourselves. That's all the process of us saying that we know that we'll be tested against what we put out there in the public domain. How it is that people then react to that, I mean, that's an open risk that you take. There will be people who will come to look at it and say, well, well, you say that you're doing this, but this project is actually about that, or it's driven by this person, or that this person has this whole basket of other associations, etc. There's a test that we set for ourselves that we know that we'll be monitored, we know that we'll be asked questions, we know that people will be scrutinising what we do, and then some will be scrutinising more rigorously than others. But I don't think those are things that I'd want to evade. I think those are things that I'd want to embrace because they make us better at what we do.
Thank you, that's clear. Other questions? So we've got a lady here, and then we'll go to Carol Mack, just a couple of rows of mics.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to all the panellists. It's been fascinating. They're really, really great presentations. I just wanted to delve in a little bit to the accountability point. And actually, I was really struck by something Fozia said about giving is seen as important, but the focus is not on what the giving achieves. And I wanted to ask you a little bit, Shenaz, you've talked about how the Aziz Foundation is looking at that transparency and accountability more. But I just wanted to ask the panellists where the drive is coming from, who you see as perhaps leading the fray on increasing that transparency and accountability going forward.
Hi, I'm Carol Mack. I'm the Chief Executive of the Association of Charitable Foundations. I'm very proud to have Fozia on my board. Our mission is to support foundations to be ambitious and effective in the way they use their resources. I'm sorry about the noise and the technology. I was so fascinated by the discussion. I've been trying to tweet it, but I'm still here. It's too distracting. So that's why I cut off midway through. I was going to ask a question about some of the discussion that's happening in the more secular foundation sector, about how foundations can use all of their assets, not just their money, but sometimes their endowments, their people, their data, their convening power to achieve their missions. And I wondered if the panel had any observations on that.
Thank you. And there was a question just at the back. Do you want to ask that now? Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, sorry to stand because I can't say anything. So I head up the Middle East Philanthropy at Save the Children. And so over the years, I've worked with a lot of philanthropists in the region as well as in the UK. And they go from quite traditional, the wells, the orphans, and then more towards the systemic change. And I think working with these Muslim philanthropists has shone a light on Save the Children. And that we also have to create an environment whereby we can work with Muslim philanthropists because they are Muslim. So both from a programmatic perspective, I think because we're a non-religious organization, we shy away from working with mosques or with kind of thought leaders in the Muslim space. And even in our offices, we do a big campaign for Christmas. We don't do anything around that. And that's changing, and you know, even our workforce is not as diversified as it definitely should be. And having these kind of diversified donor bases has kind of shone a light on Save the Children from my perspective. I'd love to know your opinions on working with non-religious organizations like ours, as big as ours or as small as ours, and what you think we need to do to work with you in a better way.
Thank you very much. If we start with you, Huda, you take any one of those three questions, and we'll try to make sure that at least one panelist answers one of the questions.
I think in terms of where the accountability is coming from, I think it's from the people who donate, essentially. Muslims are asking, where is this money going? Because I think what's happened is, one has to look at the bigger picture. Where they're in majority Muslim countries, life isn't as rosy as it could be. And the assumption was that if we give, then the people in charge will redistribute things so everyone is equal. But that's not happened. There's political strife, there is poverty, and so increasingly people are saying, well, the system's not working. And so therefore, increasingly people are saying, well, why not? And there's also a much more awareness of people's instrumentalization of the money, the opaqueness by which one gives to funds, but we don't know where they're going, the worry that actually the people that you are wanting to support are not getting what the money that you're contributing to. And I think that's where it's coming from. And I think consciously, Muslim communities are much more savvy now about wanting to have an impact and to see good. So therefore, I feel like a global context has kind of led to a much more nuanced response to, like, well, how is that contributing to the betterment of humanity specifically, or to this particular cause? So I think that's where it's come from. In terms of what can we do to work better, particularly secular organisations, I think that's been a really interesting development, and I think particularly in the work of the women's sector, we also recognise the role of secular organisations as, or the secular philosophy behind a lot of the decisions on where and what to do, and work and fund. And I think what we have tried to do at Standing Together is to say that working with religious communities, is particularly women in religious communities, is very important, because the barriers that they face to getting support are that much harder, precisely because the association of religion with a particular kind of demographic or behaviour or ideology. And so what we're doing is also very much aware of kind of working across communities, of religious communities, rather than choosing a specific one. And we're also very clear about working in partnership, so that we are not saying to communities, oh, this is how you save women, or this is what. We are saying, what can we learn from you? What kind of projects are you doing? How can we help you do things better? Where can we connect you to commissioners, or to charities, or to groups, rather than kind of assuming that the agenda is driven by us? We are purely a facilitative kind of endeavour to capacity build and enable. And if that means giving them the tools, whether it's kind of contacts or knowledge or practice, then that's what we do. But in terms of kind of what the example of the Save the Children is, I think it's important that secular organisations, or organisations that are not Muslim, do not appropriate Muslim causes. And I think that's a very difficult sort of balance to have, because it kind of, there is, I think the partnership approach is, and the co-creating approach is much more useful, because I think your value is that you are secular, or you're known for your brand. And to suddenly kind of, what I would find, as a Muslim, I would find it strange, why is Save the Children doing a Ramadan campaign? But maybe that's me needing to kind of develop and grow, because the overwhelming environment is so anti-Muslim and is so Islamophobic. It kind of feels almost disingenuous and quite opportunistic. But I think, having a much more kind of long-term, sustainable, systems-based approach to sort of religious, spiritual communities, rather than, oh, we'll tick a box by doing a campaign on X or Y. Kind of just feels a little disingenuous.
Thank you. Fozia?
Just to follow on from that, I think because of the context that we're in, Muslim organisations, and I think rightly so, view secular organisations, external organisations with a level of suspicion. So you need to be very clear about why you're approaching this organisation, because if it's an opportunistic for religion, then they will see that straight away, and you will have damaged that relationship. You need to think about why you're approaching this organisation and your perceptions. And there's a real, and this, I think this is something which goes across the whole foundation sector. There's a real underlying ethos which sometimes comes through of the white saviour mentality when approaching Muslim organisations or BME organisations, which you have to be very careful of. So to go in, as Huda was saying, with that partnership approach, with that co-creating approach, I think is really essential. And then following on in terms of who you're approaching, many Muslim communities have gatekeepers, and these are normally men. Sorry, I'm not looking at you. I'm not talking about people, but other organisations.
Can't be, I'm only 34, it can't be me.
No, it's not him. He was around, he's not in many organisations, in many communities, there are traditionally men who are gatekeepers. And so, for example, when there was an organisation which set up in Luton, an organisation of women who came together, Muslim women who said, we don't want the men to speak for us, we want to set up our own organisation. They were told, and I was part of that group, they were told by the local council of mosques that we forbid you from setting up an organisation and speaking to the council, and we will tell the council that they must not speak to you, we will tell all the stakeholders that they must not speak to you. These are real problems, these are real issues. So whenever someone says that they represent the Muslim community, be suspicious and try and find out who really represents or who has genuine voice within that community. And there was a question about facilitating and convening the role of foundations. And actually this really links into my work as part of the Community Foundation. So Community Foundations, we're place-based funders. We raise funds which we distribute just in our county. And we've moved from a position of being grant makers, quite passive grant makers, to looking at all our resources. What else can we bring to the table? So there are new initiatives that we've started. We've set up a small charities forum to help small charities in particular who are really struggling. We've set up a funders forum to bring funders together to collaborate more on how we're giving. We've set up a Women in Philanthropy network to particularly focus on gender inequality. And so this is really about using our power and our privilege as it is within that context to bring people together and to bring about much more significant impact rather than just giving grants.
Shenaz, do you want to briefly comment on any of those questions, and then we'll take some more questions.
So,
I'm conscious it's quite hot. I don't know if anyone else is feeling hot. If we can open a couple of windows, feel free, and if anyone wants to.
I'll run through in the order and I'll give really quick answers to each. So on transparency, I would say that the pressures and demands for transparency, I think, come from top, middle and bottom. From the top, from the Aziz Foundation, our chair of trustees, as I said, is a Muslim businessman. And I think it makes, I think there is a real benign value to having someone that is always computing numbers at the heart of an operation, because it really makes you scrutinise where the money is going, and so has it been wisely spent? Are there more cost-effective ways of doing something? So I think at the top. I think at the middle, I think we're seeing the emergence of a new cohort of CEOs and operating officers in Muslim charities and the Muslim philanthropic sector. And I think that's a really important development, because you're seeing a greater professionalisation of the skill sets that are brought into those roles. And I would say again from the bottom, because it is Muslim communities that are driving that change, demanding greater accountability from the institutions to which they give their money. On non-financial assets and how philanthropists can use them. So, I mean, I would agree that, again, the Aziz Foundation is also looking at how it is that we utilise our convening power particularly where we're working across Muslim communities, is how can we facilitate conversations between organisations or individuals that might not otherwise work together. But because they're both people that we're funding or projects that we're funding, how is it that we can bring them into a shared space, even though they're operating in different sections of the Muslim communities, that they recognise there's a space for all of them on that landscape? How can we do that? And then some of the other ways that we're looking is when we're giving grants, what is it that has materialised out of it, either a tangible product or an impact that can be distilled in a knowledge transfer mechanism that can then be shared with other actors in the sphere. And we're looking at methods that are utilised by academics in this respect, the knowledge transfer partnerships that universities are enabling. How is it that we can utilise some of those models with the work that we do as grant makers? And that's about making the beneficiary pool larger than just the recipient of any one particular grant. And on secular organisations, so this one is a really important one because the trends for the UK and Europe, perhaps not as much the global south, is a growth in secularity. So, you know, this I wouldn't say polarity of viewpoints, but I would say viewpoints that sit on different ends of the spectrum on religious and secular are growing. And it means that for philanthropists that are largely informed, where the ethos of the institution is informed by religion, finding ways to communicate with society that is increasingly secular, and finding ways to communicate with other institutions that operate within the philanthropic space that don't share those spiritual or the core values is instrumental, because at the end of the day, our eyes are always on the beneficiaries of our particular grant. We're interested in what will support Muslim communities and all communities in the UK to thrive in a democracy that is plural, respectful of people's differences. Not necessarily that you have to believe or you have to share a view on religion with everyone, just that you are capable of respecting someone else's position on a different place on that spectrum.
Thank you. Any other questions? Got a woman there, and then yourself.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. The zakat, the 10% contribution, is that counted as philanthropic donations, or are people expected to, to donate besides that? And also my second question is, do Muslim foundations accept interest on their funds? Because a lot of times, foundations will find it useful to have interest coming in.
I'm Felicity Jones from Mothers to Mothers, and like you say, the children, I was also thinking about the challenges to those of us who make a philanthropic ask as well, beyond the kind of appropriation and other things. We get Ramadan, we get Christmas, we get a Rosh Hashanah ask, we get a Diwali ask, we want to go beyond that mode. So my question was a more precise one about what are we getting wrong about the modalities of giving that we're offering, and also about our messaging that focuses in on the commonalities, and also those changes within Muslim philanthropy that might enable us collectively to make a leap into that commonality rather than the specifics of a kind of Muslim cycle of giving.
Thank you. And you at the front, do you have questions? Okay, I think we'll, in the terms, unless there's any other contributions from the floor, we'll just get some responses from you both. Are there any other questions, or we'll just leave it there? Would you, either of you, like to start on either of those questions?
In terms of zakat, is philanthropy, isn't it? There isn't.
Well, it's a mandatory payment, so I'm
yeah,
not, I would imagine sadaqah probably more likely.
So you can give any time, basically, but you have to give something. And I think sadaqah is kind of often used to kind of just something extra that you do on top of zakat. But yes, zakat is counted as philanthropy. That's the minimum that you have to do.
There's just on that, on page 41 actually, the Alliance says Sharik Siddiqui, who's the director of the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at Indiana University, talks about some hurdles around Muslim philanthropy and data around it. And there is a debate about how you collect data on what is either voluntary or involuntary giving, and that does relate to that question because it also affects how you collect data, and that's, we're talking about significant amounts. So for those of you that are interested in codification of Muslim giving, you might want to see that piece on 41. But I'm sorry.
No. In terms of interest, if For religious foundations that are found based on a religious figure, interest is not an option. So no, they wouldn't take interest in it.
Appropriation. Do you want to talk about appropriation? Because you've already referenced that. And Felicity's specific question about how charities working in the space should avoid that and how they can be more effective.
I mean, I wouldn't. I guess honesty about what your governing principles are is a good starting point. And if you set out to say that, you know, well, I mean, we've spoken about secularity, but I think there's a distinction between people who take no view on religion and people who take openly hostile views about religions in general, or particular religions like Islam. Those are two distinctions. We could be talking about different things. I think setting out what it is that you're interested in funding is a good starting point. And, you know, the Aziz Foundation does say that, you know, we do work with disadvantaged communities and Muslim communities a particular priority. But then, having identified target groups that may or may not bear religious identities, is not to say that the things that you're funding necessarily have an intersection with religion. It could be that, you know, we're interested in, for example, advocacy and training young Muslims to be more articulate about their needs in the public sphere. But to partner that initiative with initiatives that work with black young people and gypsy traveller young people that recognise the significance of advocacy among disadvantaged groups, and then the very specificities of what it is that they're advocating for, those are two different processes. So we can certainly do sort of collaborations across communities on the need for advocacy from within disadvantaged communities, and then look very specifically at the sources of disadvantage that any one particular community needs to speak to. And you can tailor that. You can do that either through phasing of your grant, you can do it through creating collaborative grant projects, and then projects that then spin off and become more specific to particular particular communities. I think there are ways of doing it. I don't think that these are necessarily binary models that we have to adopt and assume that there are some things that we can do with some communities that don't have a transfer into other communities. I think just how we do it is, you know, is from our starting principles, is are we interested necessarily in the religious identity of our beneficiaries, and if we are, why is the religion significant to the work that we're trying to do?
I think also partnering with Muslim charities or philanthropists is also a good way of kind of doing that too.
Well, I'm sure.
So I didn't wish to imply that wasn't an intrinsic kind of value. It was more literally a really prosaic question. That I know, for example, that we do not promote modalities of giving that fit with your modes of giving. So I think there's also a challenge to those of us putting out philanthropic acts. And, you know, I think that's an amazing kind of sort of dialogue, and to hear you outlining that. You know, we're funded by Jewish organisations, by Muslim organisations, we partner with Christian organisations. We're not defined by religious identity, but we're defined by a desire to help people access health systems. It was more a literal question about what are we getting wrong? What are we getting wrong about what we're putting out into the ether that's not providing a hook back in as well?
Does anyone have any closing thoughts on
I guess part of that can be addressed in the way as institutions, we send signals into the sector. So, you know, I mean, if we were to say, for example, that we're really interested in leadership development, but we want to do it in a way that brings people from different religious backgrounds together, and that cohort undergo their leadership training as a cohort that will engage in peer support throughout that process. I think we can send those signals to the sector by how we frame programs that we're willing to support. I don't think there aren't ways that we can't do it. I'm also conscious that what we wouldn't want to do, where we set out to say, for example, that, you know, the bulk of our work is with Muslim communities, to not create the balance between wanting to do it in an inter-religious context, but recognise that there is a lot of other work that we want to do that is very specific to a particular religious group.
And in answer to all those questions, philanthropy is clearly, and foundations like yours are going to be relevant to these ongoing conversations. And I think that if anyone had any doubt about that, I think hopefully that's been dispelled by the contributions here. And it's on that note, I would like to thank Shenaz, Huda and Aziz Fozia for all their contributions. And just a few closing comments. First of all, on a prosaic note, seeing as that's been mentioned, please do complete those evaluation forms. If you are able to and willing to subscribe today, you can have 20% off Alliance magazine. If you're willing to do more than subscribe and contribute to the Alliance community, which is a community of practitioners of philanthropy around the world, there's over 20,000 of them, please do think about how you might want to contribute, either intellectually but also financially, to help us kind of sustain our non-profit philanthropy-focused journalism. It's a challenging environment out there for non-profits, but in particular media non-profits as well, and we do need and want your support. I hope you can see what your support can make possible in terms of the topics we cover. In terms of those topics, up next in December is an edition on royal philanthropy that has some intersections with some of the questions here. Then systems change in the new year, and again there was some reference to systemic interventions. And then we're looking at human rights and social justice philanthropy later in 2019 as well. I would like to just play a specific thanks to the Alliance team. We're only a team of 4 people, and 2 of my colleagues are here today, Zibran up here and Amy at the back, and a lot of the work that we do is only possible because of their contributions, and it's a real privilege to be working with them, the work that you do. So I just think it's important to recognise that as well. And of course, thank you to all of you for attending the breakfast clubs and these discussions and helping keep conversations open about philanthropy, being a critical friend of the field. Not all of the articles in this issue and other issues are critical, but we, for example, the reference to Saudi Arabia was mentioned in one of the questions, and there's a piece by a foundation set up by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and readers might want to draw their own conclusions about how compelling they find that particular piece. But the point is that we want readers to be able to draw their own conclusions based on what they see, providing a spread and perspective of views as best as we can through the journalism we do. We'll try our best to hold a mirror to the field and be a critical friend. So thank you for helping to enable us in that task. We can always do better, so we do want your feedback as well as your support, and we hope to see you at the next events in the new year. But please, if I can end just by thanking our panellists, Fozia, Huda and Shenaz, thank you very much.